And welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon. I trust that you all enjoyed the lunch, right? Did you enjoy the lunch? And welcome back to our online audience as well as the in-studios. Now, the thing that you must know about the lunch, if you're surprised to see only vegetables, a plant-based diet, it's intentional. Because when we're talking about circular economy, circularity, and we've talked about it earlier this morning as well, that food systems plays a role. So it's not just about talking the talk, it's also about walking the walk. Now, this next session is all about circular trade and value chains. We're going to be exploring intercontinental trade dynamics on the continent, stressing the potential of circular supply chains, trade, and services related to electronic waste, amongst other things. To moderate this entire session, I'd like you to join me in welcoming a person who holds a master's in administration in mechanical engineering from the University of Hanover in Germany. He has also managed the Research Center for Refrigeration and Heat Pumps in Germany and heads his own consultancy, undertaking research for international industries, NGOs, and governments. This person, your moderator for this next session, is Stefan Sikars. Let's give him a round of applause as he comes to the stage.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, here and at home at the screens, I would like to welcome you to the session on circular trade and value chains of the 2022 World Circular Economy Forum, organized by Chatham House, our partner organizations UNEP, Circle Economy, and the International Chamber of Commerce, and by UNIDO, which is actually my home, so to say. And we will discuss some of the opportunities and challenges related to trade and the circular economy, in particular in Africa. There is the question of the continent's role in global value chains, in particular in circular value chains, and the questions around the African, or challenges around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and of course opportunities as well. No single country can achieve circular economy alone. Rather, there's a dependency between all of us, no matter whether we are in the global north or in the global south. And this dependency is created through the international trade that we are all taking part in. Efficient and streamlined trade in circular goods, services, and materials faces so far still quite a lot of technical, procedural, and legal challenges. International trade and circular economy are somewhat symbiotic. Trade is important to facilitate the circular economy transition, but reversely, the global circular economy transition will also alter global trade patterns. Today, we will explore the intersections between the international trade and the circular economy. We'll unpack the term circular trade, and we will explore how circular trade can be more equitable and inclusive. Then we will do, by means of an example, you might say, a deeper dive into challenges and opportunities, in particular to the trade in ICT and electronics. And to start off, I'm very proud that I can welcome Aik Hoi Lim, who leads the World Trade Organization's work on environmental sustainability, climate change, and trade, as well as on the agreement on the technical barriers to trade. He has strengthened WTO's partnership with UNEP as well as with other international environmental organizations, and has led the establishment of WTO's Trade and Environment Week, which is now an annual flagship event for his organization. So please, I would like to invite Mr. Aik Ho Lim now to provide his keynote speech on trade pathways in support of an inclusive and global circular economy. Aik Ho Lim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the invitation to participate at the World Circular Economy Forum. And of course, my sincere thanks also to the host, the Rwandan government, for hosting this forum. I mean, clearly from the introduction that you've already heard from the moderator, that I don't really need to tell this audience that too much of the economic growth in today's world is still based on the linear take, make, discard approach. Resources are being extracted, traded, and processed into goods, which are then, of course, used and discarded too much as waste or emissions. So clearly, as you already set the scene, moderator, that the challenge is to transform that model to one that decouples economic growth from resource use in a way that will support sustainable development. And how do we do that in such a way by which we minimize waste, we keep products and materials in use, and that we create resource efficiencies that better enable stronger and more fruitful human and environmental outcomes. So that's clearly the challenge that we have before us. And together with that challenge, I would argue that such a profound transformation can only be done if it's supported and enabled by international trade. And that's the case for many reasons. But let me just highlight maybe just a few in these opening remarks. Firstly, let's look at trade, the objective of trade itself. Trade will be essential to achieve goals of circular economy through material and resource efficiency. In a world with global value chains, trade plays an important role in moving materials around the world. And the materials that it moves and how it does so will, of course, have environmental impacts. So the business of trade itself has to become more circular. And the circular economy approach must also consider trade. Otherwise, we will miss a very big part of the picture of sustainability and sustainable development. And if we look at things from that perspective, international trade will also have a huge potential to help overcome key obstacles that prevent the circular economy from taking off. The replacement of traditional material inputs with renewable, bio-based, or recovered ones often requires large scale and volume to become economically viable and to deliver environmental benefits. And that same logic goes for production of secondary raw materials from waste. And here we get to the very essence of what international trade does. I mean, trade connects demand for circular goods with supply, and it creates the incentives to shift to a more sustainable production methods while minimizing costs. But at the same time, there are challenges. One very key challenge is that we see a proliferation of domestic initiatives, which is good in one sense, such as eco-design, recyclability standards, circular economy standards, and so forth. They certainly bring positive outcomes, but they also create challenges. Since, as I spoke about international trade as being connected through global value chains, if we have many different regulations, many different standards, and many different ways of measuring circular economy, this will make the value chain increasingly difficult to engage in and to enter. And without that value chain operating globally, international trade will be very hard to do its part to support the circular economy. So therefore, multilateral cooperation will be a very important part of moving, hopefully, towards the development of more global standards. And then there's the challenge of trade barriers themselves. This is an area that the WTO works on, of course, and trade to innovation. They can also limit material efficiency. For instance, import restrictions. Of course, they are often needed for different reasons, but we need to look carefully at them to see how are they operating, whether import restrictions on used or discarded components are preventing recycling companies from obtaining inputs in sufficient quantities, therefore rendering their activities uneconomical, as when compared to traditional virgin material producers. Similarly, diverging standards and regulations on circular economy components, such as refurbished goods and secondary parts, may also limit the extent to which circular business innovators can access markets and enjoy economies of scale. So if we are going to move the circular economy agenda, I think there's a need to also look at the international trade policy agenda and how can that support circularity. And that will, of course, mean international cooperation, or in our case, international trade cooperation. The WTO can provide the rules, it can provide the framework for a level playing field to happen in the circular economy, but we also need to change the way we work in international trade, because the international trade system was designed with a linear economy in mind. It was not designed with a circular economy in mind. The good news, though, is that there are discussions going on at the WTO, looking more concretely at how trade policy can support the circular economy. And I'll just mention a few of these areas. At the WTO, we have a Committee on Trade and Environment. The subject of circular economy has been very much at the forefront of its discussions. Our members are showcasing how they are using and integrating circular economy principles, including efforts to address sustainable supply chains and related trade and eco-labeling schemes. There's also another committee, that's the Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade. This is looking at technical regulations and standards. Within this committee, there's also discussion on trade issues and how can we get better alignment towards international standards that can support the circular economy, and at the same time recognizing that there are sometimes specific trade concerns that arise in the use of technical regulations and standards. A good part of the work is on transparency. There's a need to know what's happening out there. And here we do have a system for tracking notifications, covering many issues, including on circular economy. We now have close to something like 450 notifications related to the circular economy. These range from technical regulations on waste management and recycling, to eco-design standards for recyclability, to conformity assessment for retreaded or reused goods, standards for biodegradable products, and so forth. My main point here is that there is a growing activity in the circular economy which intersects with international trade, a lot of it in the area of technical regulations and standards. And we need to look at this carefully so that this does not lead to fragmentation, that this actually helps the circular economy and does not actually hinder it. And here I'm speaking, of course, of a global circular economy. I should mention very quickly that there are also two new initiatives at the WTO, which are involving WTO members on trade and environmental sustainability and on plastics pollution. In these discussions, there's a dedicated working group on the circular economy. They are looking at members' experiences to advance circular economy goals linked to trade and trade policies. We just had these discussions last week, and this week we're having one on plastics and plastics pollution. Much of this, I think, will be of interest to you in the World Circular Economy Forum. They touch on issues such as how do we reduce unsustainable resource use, promote resource efficiency and sustainability, and what are some of the trade-related aspects of such work. The same thing applies as well to plastics pollution. Here, the question has been really about how can the circular economy support work on reducing plastics pollution and the use of environmentally sustainable plastics alternatives and substitutes, and therefore lead to a more sustainable plastics trade. And again, I won't go into depth, but I think this is a very interesting area of work, looking at the linkage between circular economy and plastics. Lastly, just to talk a little bit about some very concrete trade pathways, I would say, where I think we would really benefit from the discussions from World Circular Economy Forum, as well as our discussions, to try to connect the dots between trade and circular economy. Firstly, it's distinguished between waste and reusable materials. If we don't do this, reusable materials end up being redirected from productive purposes, such as remanufacturing or recycling, to the waste stream, an outcome that is contrary to the circular economy. And much of this work is going to be about improving what we call in the WTO and customs world, the harmonized system. That's a system for classifying products, and to do this in collaboration with the Basel Convention. So classification is one of the key issues, and a proper classification.
Because we are running out of time, that would be really great. Thank you so much.
So I have a longer statement here, which I can circulate to you. But I think the main point to close is that you can look at these areas, classification, you can look at trade barriers, and these are about tariffs or non-tariff barriers. You can also look at services. Services trade is key to the circular economy. And in all of these areas, you've got many, many trade restrictions, and some which are really particularly directed to the circular economy. And lastly, capacity building. Circular economy is a very new concept for many developing countries. And if you ask them trade and circular economy, that's an even newer concept. So a lot of work here on developing capacity, both regulatory capacity on the ground, as well as the trade policy capacity. WTO can offer some of this through its work on aid for trade, but we also look forward to working with other organizations in working in this area of capacity. So that's it, really. And, I think my final point is simply to say that, if we move towards the circular economy, let's not lose sight of the international trade policy dimension of the circular economy. It can be a fantastic enabler. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lim, for this very interesting and insightful trade statement. And I would like now to welcome Dr. Jack Berry to the podium, who is a research fellow at Chatham House and leads pioneering research examining the intersections between the circular economy and international trade, geopolitics, finance, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Yes, exactly. Here we go. He regularly advises high-ranking public sector officials and private sector leaders, and today us. And we talk in particular about him being the author of the Framework for Inclusive Circular Trade, which was published this summer. So if you want to give us some insights into your publication, role of trade for an inclusive circular economy, and maybe the working definition on circular trade that you're suggesting there. Maybe you can explain to us how you foresee this definition to work.
I don't know if mic's working. Great. So ICO touched a little bit on it, but in this publication, we tried to kind of define what the term circular trade is in a tangible way that makes sense to everyone. So as far as we see it, and this discussion is still open, circular trade is any international trade transaction that contributes to the transition to a circular economy, whether that's at local, national, or international levels. And so it's really an umbrella term for many different types of trade flows. So an example of one kind of category, I guess, is the trade in circular economy enabling goods, services, and intellectual property. And if organizations can get access to these, it better enables them to perform circular activities, reuse, repair, recycling, and new business models. So circular goods could be like remanufacturing equipment, digital equipment, industrial biotechnologies, material science, all range of different goods. Services range from circular design services, educational services, through to recycling services. And then IP, critically, which is not discussed much, I think, in the trade context, is like access to knowledge on how to repair or remanufacture products and the spare parts and tools to do that, which are generally held privately. So that's one category. The second category out of three is the trade in used goods. And these are used goods that are intended for reuse in secondary markets, but it can also be the trade in remanufactured or refurbished goods. And the benefit of that type of trade flow is secondary markets, particularly in low-income countries, gain access to affordable goods and critical goods, sometimes like medical equipment, which wouldn't be affordable if you're buying primary goods. And then the third category is the trade in secondary raw materials and waste that can be valorized and reintegrated back into the industrial production system. And the obvious benefits of that is you're moving them around the world to areas with economies of scale and demand to actually make them economical to reinsert them into the industrial system. So that's the kind of three brackets and categories that I like to kind of start with, at least.
You just mentioned scale. Can you give us a feel for the scale of circular trade in terms of monetary value or another indicator that gives us a feel how it is and how it might develop?
Yeah, so we've kind of, at Chatham House, we crunched the numbers provided by UN Comtrade to try and understand how much circular trade is going on. And since around 2000 to 2019, so the past 20 years, it's grown from around $90 billion US per year to 330 billion. So that's a 230% increase. And that's compared to a 190% increase in just the average trade of goods growth. So it's growing much faster, actually, than the average trade in goods growing. You can also look at individually, so the growth of trade in circular services, which, again, Aiko said is critical. That's grown in terms of repair and maintenance services around the world, has grown from around 70 billion to 113 billion just in the past 5 years. So you're seeing a massive growth in services as well. But there's a big caveat to these numbers, which is we just do not have the granular data to tell us what's actually going on with all these different trade flows. And Aiko touched on that with the harmonized system of codes, which is generally the main approach to monitor and report on these traded goods. And although the global trading regime evolved to support the linear flow of primary goods, it's not very good at picking up the reverse flow of those. So there's many different problems with that. I won't go into it because of time, but I think there's a real opportunity, not just to improve the HS codes, but also to think about more innovative trade facilitation approaches where we can gather this data and complement the data collected by harmonized system and codes, and whether that's through digital product passports or increased traceability and transparency. There's lots of different ways we can do that.
Maybe we leave the topic of data for a moment and move further. We had in the intro quickly mentioned the need for inclusivity. Can you advise what's your take on why circular economy trade needs to be inclusive and how to get there?
It's a big question. It's an important question. And when I described circular trade, I gave you some positive examples. But there's equally really big challenges with these flows. Aiko obviously touched on illicit trade in hazardous waste. There's a lot of grey areas and loopholes currently in the trading system, which can make it very easy to bypass the rules and do this. And this has obvious ramifications for citizens in importing countries. But there's bigger challenges as well. For example, if you scale up the flow of used goods, whether that's textiles, electronics, cars, that can flood secondary markets and really have an impact on fledgling industries. And it can also flood the waste management systems of these countries. Because if you get big flow of really poor quality used goods which have no resale value, hazardous potential, then that puts huge strain on these waste management systems. So there's a really big element there. But if you scale out again, we're kind of crunching the same numbers, and we think there's a circular trade divide happening at the moment between global north and global south, in that around 99% of captured value from circular trade is being captured between high and middle income countries, with only 1% of that value capture in low income countries. And obviously the caveat, there's a data gap there, particularly intra-regional trade in emerging markets. But I think the sentiment is there that there's a huge value divide, but not just value, there's a quality divide. So we're seeing very high quality circular trade flows between industrialized countries, but a gravitation towards low quality trade flows into low income countries and emerging markets, and that's like industrial lubricants and solvents, which are costly to do anything with, and you can't get any value out of them, or it's used electronics which fall apart after 2 weeks, poor fast fashion clothing which has no resale value. So there's a quality divide as well, and unless the global community comes together and really thinks this through, we have a real fear that this circular trade divide is going to get bigger. And then if you layer on the geopolitical risks and tensions in which countries are taking more unilateral action, seeing the circular economy as a tool for competition, that divide's going to get even further.
Thank you so much. And in particular also, I mean, if I look at the discussions we had this morning here in this room, we all know our ambitions to make inclusive circular economy, but it is evident from what you say that you assume there is lots of value to be had in the trade, but it seems that we have to continue working hard to make it actually happening in the global south. And that brings me to the framework for inclusive circular trade that Chatham House has co-developed, and which includes the African Circular Economy Alliance, the Latin American Caribbean Circular Economy Coalition, the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and us at UNIDO. And maybe you can very quickly go through what that is and what are the recommendations and what are they working on?
Yeah, well, essentially, we came together as a group to really think through this trade divide and how the global trading regime and the circular economy communities can come together and deliver tangible actions to try and overcome these challenges. And so the framework that we kind of co-developed, it lays out a kind of strategy with very detailed objective outlines. You can go and look at it online. I won't go into those details, but there's 5 overarching areas that need to be focused on, and ICO touched on 4 of them. Definitions and classifications of goods and circular processes. At the moment, we don't have a shared vernacular or language around the world on what this means. And if we don't have a shared language, then coming to design trade rules and trade facilitation measures gets very complicated. On top of that, if you layer on top of that, is around barriers to trade. So standards, regulations, and conformity assessment procedures. They all need to be addressed. Trade facilitation measures, so I guess also picked up in the panel, but prior informed consent procedure, there's various opportunities there. Capacity building, particularly around providing infrastructure, skills, and training for low-income countries, not just to implement things like the prior informed consent procedure, but actually to take advantage of the potential value that is in these trade flows through their industrial systems. So there's a huge amount of capacity building there. And then finally, the one that ICO didn't touch on is on trade and economic agreements. How we can embed the circular economy underpinned by just transition and environmental justice principles within trade agreements, both plurilateral, regional, wherever. There's huge scope there to make big change.
Thank you very much, Jack. That sounds very interesting and challenging. And again, let me point out, the value is there. The question is, who is positioning himself as a country, as a society, as a group, as an industry, at the point where the maximum value can be generated? And I would like to introduce now, or ask the panel members to come here to the podium, which is Lydia, Reinhard, and Kimberly. And I will introduce them as they come, but let me introduce that we are now... Here we have them. Because we, the panel in particular, will now discuss the opportunities and challenges facing circular trade in electronics and the ICT sector, which is already a very developed sector. Biggest concern is, of course, the transboundary movement of e-waste, pointed here to waste, the fastest growing waste stream. There is an 83% of treatment of e-waste is unknown, meaning it's exported for treatment, but that doesn't necessarily happen. And 65% of transboundary movements are uncontrolled used e-waste. A common method to do that is mixing e-waste with other shipments, just shipping it out, and many of you, particularly in Africa, have had that problems, which is one of the reasons why we have the Basel Convention in the first place. Now, having this situation, how can trade be used in waste and electronics to make the whole thing circular, more circular? For this, we turn to our panel, so Kimberly Botwright, and then we have Lydia Eswa on the very right and Reinhard Schmidt in the middle. And I will start with Lydia. Lydia has over 20 years of experience in development planning and public financial management in the civil service of Ghana. She has risen through the ranks to the position of a director and is now responsible for the policy formulation in the areas of e-waste and plastics management, two massively large challenges today. She is negotiating and implementing also projects like, for example, the German-funded project on sustainable management of e-waste and a project that we have the honor to have in UNIDO with Ghana to establish a circular economy framework for plastics in Ghana. So, question to you. How much e-waste, Lydia, is currently imported into Ghana? And what challenges or what opportunities do you see for your country in these imports?
So thank you so much for the question. You started by giving us some data on e-waste volumes. For us in Ghana, currently we do not have importation of electronic waste into the country. However, there are electronic and electrical equipments that are imported into the country, which comes in as used goods. So these products come in and they can be refurbished and put on the market again for ordinary people to buy. We have a classical example of electro-recycling, bringing in televisions which have one or two parts not working. It is fixed in Ghana, put on the market, and it's a brand new television that is sold. So to talk of figures for electronic waste importation into Ghana, currently we do not have that data. In 2009, however, a country assessment was done. And the data that we got out of that country assessment was the fact that about 20% of the used electrical and electronic equipment that came into the country were e-waste. So the challenge is that the used goods or the second-hand goods come in disguised as used goods. But then when we go into the details, that is where the issue of electronic waste come out, because as many as 20% of them are electronic waste. I must quickly add that we have some support from the Global Environment Facility working with the World Bank to do a current e-waste inventory. And that exercise has just started. In 2023, the report will be ready and we'll be able to put out the current figures and data on e-waste in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to, of course, stay on the continent logically and move over to Reinhard Schmidt, who is the South African co-founder of Closing the Loop and responsible for the operations of Closing the Loop in all of Africa. Of course, because of this work, he has a lot of experience in the work with the informal sector in the collection of electronic waste and in transporting the waste for responsible recycling. He's also involved in discussions to develop business models that facilitate the collection and the sound recycling of electronic waste from developing countries in general. Together with the Prevent Waste Alliance and the STEP initiative, he worked on a discussion paper regarding the practical implementation of the Basel Convention, prior informed consent procedure, which was published this summer. So, much of the trade e-waste creates unfair social or environmental burdens on the importing country. Is there a fairer way to hold the producers of waste more accountable?
There's definitely a fairer way, but I would think that we would step away from the accountability and the fairness and look at what opportunities are there. We embrace the concept called waste compensation, whereby we have two realities in the world. We have, in particular, the global north, you could say. There's a demand for circularity, obviously. We have these conferences. Companies want to be more sustainable. They want to be more circular, organizations, governments. But it's sometimes very hard to get tangible first steps. We're all talking about future steps. So how do we do something now? There's a demand there on the one side. On the other side, there's a demand in Africa, many African countries, but in the global south as a whole, for waste management, waste collection, waste shipments, waste treatment. You can actually create opportunities by looking at both of these. The demand of these users of electronics in the global north, trying to make that use more sustainable, they're willing to pay to do that. And that money can be used as a financing mechanism to collect, transport, recycle electronic waste from African countries, especially if you do that in an inclusive way, in a fair way, and especially in a transparent way. You mentioned already, transparency will create a lot of opportunities. Doing so transparently creates, it makes it visible what the business opportunities are in a country like Ghana. It makes it visible how much waste there is, how much waste is being transported, and therefore, maybe there's a business opportunity in doing it locally, if that becomes transparent. So I think a business model where you really look at the two opportunities, the two demands, global north, global south, combine them, then you're moving away from accountability, but to a demand for more sustainability.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we have time a little bit later to drill more into that, which we will be delighted to do, but only after talking to Mrs. Kimberly Botwright, who is the head of sustainable trade at the World Economic Forum, where she runs programs on supply chain sustainability, circular trade, and climate change. Previously, at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, she worked there, and at the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. So maybe you can refer back to Reinhard, who gave us some ideas how he sees the solutions to e-waste. And maybe you can give us a more global bird's eye view on what is happening and how Reinhard's view fits into there.
Good question. So to answer it, I'm going to get technical on two global institutions that have already been mentioned by this panel. I think it offers important context for the business environment that people like Reinhard have to operate in, or rather the policy environment that businesses have to operate in. So there were two significant developments in the last year that affect e-waste trade. In June, at the Basel Convention COP, parties agreed to do two things. They expanded the definition of hazardous e-waste trade that is controlled by the PIC procedure. They also then said that all e-waste, regardless of whether it's hazardous or not, or whether it contains hazardous components or not, should also be added to Annex 2 of the Basel Convention, and that means it is also controlled by the PIC procedure. So we now have a situation where both hazardous e-waste and also non-hazardous e-waste, but for significant reasons because of its negative environmental impacts, must be controlled when it's moved from one country to another. In addition, because of the way that the Basel Convention is structured, it also means that none of the e-waste can move from the EU to a developing economy, nor can it move in or out of the United States, and there are technical reasons for that. So I think that's important for helping us think through where these flows can happen to and from, and how we create economies of scale when we're talking about dealing with e-waste and recycling it. Secondly, we've talked a little bit about getting more visibility on where these flows are happening. Now, Ho Lim from the WTO mentioned the HS system. There was a very positive development that the World Customs Organization, working in collaboration with the Basel Convention, agreed to new HS codes for e-waste. Amazingly, we didn't have this before. So in our system of classifying traded goods, we had customs codes for waste and scrap in batteries and accumulators. We did not have any other customs codes for any other type of e-waste. So what would happen is when it would move across borders, traders would find different ways to classify it, and customs officials themselves would also try and interpret different ways to deal with this product, this waste that was coming in. And then that then affects how they then treat it. So what we now have is a new heading for e-waste, and actually that then has specific subheadings within it for different types of e-waste. So I think that will be really helpful for countries to get a better sense of what's happening and what's moving in and out of their country. It would also be helpful in theory for Basel Convention implementation, but I say in theory because a lot of this will depend on proper implementation of both of these policy advances that then creates that enabling environment for the responsible trade and really helps to clamp down on the illegal trade that is nonetheless happening.
Kimberly, maybe I can dig a little bit deeper, just for everyone. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware this Basel Convention essentially requires, if one country wants to export something which is on the list, to notify the other country where they wanted to export it to and get their consent for this. So if you're a company, you go to your company who wants to export something for recycling, you go to your government contacts the government of the target country contacts typically the industry there, then the industry says, yes, I want to buy this, target country, back to the company who gets then an export-import license out of that, and we start. That is the prior informed consent procedure. Now, I can see how that is very important to keep things under control, and in particular e-waste, as previously said by Lydia, e-waste had let's say, secondary goods, electronic and electric goods, had the tendency to be actually e-waste and being basically imported or exported illegally. But now, of course, we have a situation where we have higher requirements on companies. Isn't that a contradiction in wanting to facilitate circular trade, to ask for higher compliance effort with regulations? And how do you get over that?
Indeed, I think it's both the challenge and the opportunity. So it is a very good thing that we control hazardous and environmentally harmful trade. It is important that countries are able to control what comes in to their economies and what doesn't. Also, as Jack mentioned, the import of waste where you don't have environmentally sound management systems in your country or not enough to handle, that is really problematic. However, we need to then have a system that controls the trade efficiently and effectively for there to be commercial, responsible recycling trade. And I say commercial because if there isn't that commercial angle, then this won't be integrated into real circular business models. We can't ask businesses to do this on a sort of pro rata basis or for them to lose money over several years. For example, we are aware that some Basel PIC notifications can take anywhere between 18 months to 4 years. That's really problematic when you're trying to design a supply chain or when you're trying to work within a system that calls for materials recycling and reuse.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. I would like to very quickly refer back to Jack, actually. I'm shocking my panel a little bit because this is not scripted, but I hope that I know they're absolutely on top of the topic, so that's okay. You mentioned before, Jack, in your introduction, several areas of circular trade and kind of differentiated depending on what kind of trade, whether it's in services, whether it's in secondary raw materials. Is the solution to problems like this to kind of cordon off maybe from the circular trade those which are in the immediate vicinity to waste and progress with the rest, or is it, would that lead into the wrong direction? What do you think?
It's a good question. It's difficult to answer because of the heterogeneity of circular trade flows. But that is in effect what the Basel Convention is there trying to do, and doing quite well. It's going through amendments, and so I would say that's there to capture that. But the flip side is, like the first category I gave, which is circular enabling goods, services, and IP, right? So the same, Kimberly produced a great report on defining what goods are that deliver climate benefits and to enable trade in climate beneficial goods. We need the same for circular economy enabling goods. In fact, they're so intertwined and interlinked. That discussion is not even near the table yet in terms of the trade discussions. Climate goods, yes, we need clear definitions on circular goods as well, and that needs to be put together. So you build on top of the Basel that's the safety net. Everything else, you've got to try and facilitate and enable much more easier, whether it's improving the PIC procedure, or I'm sure Reinhardt's got some very practical examples as well, how you facilitate much more efficient and streamlined trade.
So if I look at that, how is it, Lydia, how do you deal, actually meaning your government, deals with the imported and with the domestically produced e-waste, and who else is needed to cooperate with? Is your area of cooperation, the group, dealing with that complete, or do you have gaps where additional actors are needed?
Thank you. So for governments, there are two key areas that government is using to address the issues. The first one is setting up the legal and regulatory framework to be able to guide companies and individuals within the e-waste sector. And as a result, government came up with what we call the Act 917, the E-Waste Management Act, and its legislative instrument, LI 2250, to operationalize the implementation of the Act. So basically, the Act looks at provisions on the import, the export, transit of hazardous waste, and how it should be managed, and the issues of notification, which you rightly mentioned. The Act provides good guidance on that. The second part is also looking at how private sector can come in to support government in managing the waste that results from the used equipments that come in. So it talks about issues of take-back systems that should be set up by private sector. It also talks about the payment of eco-levy by producers and manufacturers so that the end products can be sustainably recycled. It also looks at issues of setting up recycling plants in country that can be used to recycle the waste that finds itself in the country. So who are the other collaborators that government looks forward to engaging? I mentioned earlier, the private sector plays a key role, and therefore continuously government is engaging the private sector. The challenge we've had up until now is that the issue of the collection of the eco-levy, and therefore the argument has always been, if we are paying the eco-levy, why should we come back and support in other areas with regards to the setting up of the recycling and treatment plants and those other things. But we are still engaging them, and we hope that, for instance, next year, one of the key things that we are seeking to do in terms of managing e-waste has to do with the setting up of the take-back systems. So you bring the television, you bring the fridges in country when there are issues or they are out of use. do you have a depot or a place where the consumer can return the product, and then whatever arrangements and mechanisms that are available, the consumer can take advantage of it. So yes, there are gaps, a lot of gaps that needs to be filled, but it calls for continuous collaboration and engagement with all the actors within the e-waste space, and that's what we continually seek to do.
Thank you very much, Lydia. And you just mentioned, of course, the private sector repeatedly, and which I use as an opportunity to go back to Reinhard, who had previously advocated for compensation of one or the other way. But in addition to or outside the option of having compensation schemes, what other policies or on-the-ground developments are required to tackle the e-waste challenge, in particular through the private sector?
There's a lot of policies and things like trade facilitation that can be used, but I think one of the main things is to look at now, not to look at additional, beyond future. There's so much talk, especially at conferences like these, about we need to design for this, we need to go to 2050 this, 2030 this, but there's a lot of things being done right now that need to be facilitated, that need to be supported to be scaled. This morning's session on with the entrepreneurs was a fantastic example of that. I heard people talking about how enlightening that was, that there was people doing things right now. I'm borrowing a quote from someone that I completely agree with, but I think sometimes circularity is stuck in the future. You know, we're talking about what we're going to do one day instead of what we're doing right now. And it's one of the reasons I said, okay, let's do this panel as well, because trade facilitation, looking at breaking down these barriers, even for companies such as mine, but plastics companies have the same issues. If you can't export your waste in a transparent way, or in a legal way even, then you can never build a business environment that will enable local recycling. You can never go that way. So looking at breaking down those barriers right now, for companies doing things right now, I think that's the essential thing that we need.
Thank you very much. Yeah, applause in the room for all of those who can't hear it. Now, if we look at slightly different aspects that we touched on before, which is the question, how do we get inclusiveness in the e-waste trade, or some sort of equity? Maybe I start with Lydia here. And what do you see as future opportunities for actually trading e-waste or parts of e-waste in and for Ghana? And are you aware, are there barriers for businesses in Ghana to take advantage from that? And can they be addressed, as from Reinhard just requested, immediately and fast to get rolling?
Yes, so for us in Ghana, we see a lot of opportunities within the electronic and electrical equipment space. For instance, with the importation or exportation comes along with the creation of businesses. So if you want to export, you need to be a business to be able to export. As a result of creating this SME, small and medium scale enterprises, job opportunities are provided for a lot of people within the private sector. And for Ghana, we have the youth, a lot more people operating within the electronic waste management space. So if you talk about exports and electronic waste, then you are talking about creating the opportunities for this teeming youth to have access to jobs and also be able to improve their living standards in country. In terms of collection of e-waste, the efficiency level for the informal sector in Ghana is so high, 97%. They are the ones that go into the nooks and the crannies and bring the equipment out, and then it's handed over to the formal companies who now package and will now export it. So in terms of opportunities, we see this great opportunity for employment. The other thing has to do with the fact that we are talking about urban mining and secondary minerals. which we have in electronic waste management. So valuable metals like gold and iron, copper, etc. So it's something that is also lucrative for businesses because they make profits out of it. In terms of what are the barriers and how can we manage it for businesses? The key barriers for us, we see as building the capacity of these SMEs to be able to go through the notification processes and make things simplified and easier so that they can export. And that we are already doing. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Lydia. Reinhard, from your side, how would you react to that, or what would you like to amend from your perspective?
Yeah, I pick out the efficiency part, indeed. Working with the informal sector, circularity is a big topic. If we focus specifically on waste, waste management is part of circular economy. The informal sector in Africa, for example, is massive, very efficient, very effective. But they lack access to being able to reach the markets, for example, in Europe. They lack access to be able to do permitting and that sort of thing. So really giving them a seat at the table. Instead of me sitting here, it should be the people who are collecting the waste sitting here. I know in the studio in Lagos, there's people collecting waste that are in there. There's someone in this room as well that is specifically busy with collecting plastic waste in Lagos. And they're the ones that we need to involve and work with them, not for them, but work with them to figure out what is it they need to build a sustainable livelihood and not live from day to day anymore. And for that, you need innovative new business models. We need to try things that might fail, but at least we try them.
Thank you very much, Reinhard. And now, yeah, exactly, that deserves another round of applause. And maybe Kimberly can now go to the overall view again, and maybe you can compare a little bit what happens outside e-waste, what happens in e-waste versus outside e-waste with other secondary raw materials, other waste streams. Is e-waste something like an early bird or lagging behind, and what's actually moving which would be relevant for e-waste as well?
Thanks for that. So I do think it's relevant to take a step back when we're talking about trade and different material streams to think about this, to think about how they're different in the types of trade that we might want for circularity in each of those material streams. So we've talked a lot about electronics here. I think electronics differ from plastics because in electronics, we're probably not going to have a big conversation around moving to alternatives. There'll be some elements maybe, but we all know that we're using electronics. We're going to keep using a lot more electronics. It's vital for our future growth patterns. So we really do have to focus on this recycling conversation and get that right and make sure we're enabling those responsible players in the system to be able to get the permits and move effectively. In plastics, which I compare to electronics, plastics was already listed under the Basel Convention a year ago by parties. So they have also listed all plastic waste, even though it's non-hazardous, on that Annex 2 non-hazardous list. So we know that plastics causes environmental damage, therefore it goes on that list. We control the plastic waste when it moves across our borders. Plastic and electronics are similar in that respect, so they have to undergo this PIC procedure. But plastics is different because, and there are now ongoing negotiations, so I would say plastics is a little bit further forward at the UN level for a new global treaty on plastic pollution. There we need to have really important conversations around substitutes and alternatives reduction. Those are all really key, and they bring in slightly different trade conversations, some of which Jack and Ho-Lim alluded to. Last comparison that I'll go to is textiles. So here, again, it's quite similar to plastics in the sense of we need to maybe be thinking about alternatives, we need to be thinking about reduction, we need to be thinking about that kind of reuse, etc. But it's different then to electronics and plastics in the sense of it's not Basel Convention listed. So we don't really have that same control at the moment, and an open question as to whether we would want that. I think just coming back to the sort of the open question of whether we want that, it really depends on how well this notification process is implemented, on whether it's successful in enabling that responsible trade and then disincentivizing or catching the illegal trade. Because if it's not well implemented, all we will end up with is people like Reinhard and the waste pickers that he works with not being able to implement this responsible, sustainable trade, and we'll end up with a lot of illegal flows that we're not catching. So my call is for good implementation.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. And maybe going back to Jack on all of that, after having heard your contributions to the topic, all of yours, Jack was in the beginning working on many more issues than the actual trade in waste, potential secondary raw materials, or older goods. You were mentioning services, repair, spare parts, a lot of other things. How do we capture actually the advancing of circular economy through trade across all these dimensions? This very complex dimension that we just had, but on the one hand complex, on the other hand advanced, because there are international instruments in existence, not yet perfect, but in existence. How do we advance trade as a whole? And I believe, from my perspective, trade in circular economy is not only limited to, let's say, end of first life and later. There's so much more in the circular economy and in trade. So how do we open that? How do we discuss it in the future?
I mean, I covered it, I guess, in your questions. I don't even know if we should try to do that all as one thing. I mean, we suggested the term circular trade for conceptually understand it. Whether we should try and pull it all together in one thing, I think is too complex. And it goes back to what Reinhard was saying, right? We've got big structural long-term changes that we need to make in the trade regime, but there's also immediate things that we can do. And I want to pick up on that point because I think that's so critical. There's things in trading mechanisms that can be used today to solve some of the problems that the panel mentioned. If you have traceable and transparent value chains underpinned by strong protocols, which are already being developed today. UNICE have done brilliant work on garments and textiles, for example, which can be translated across value chains. Those are underpinned by harmonized or mutually recognized standards. There's not even a globally recognized standard on remanufacturing, for example. If we can get that, then we can do some really innovative things like authorized economic operators, where pre-agreed operators importing into countries can go through green lanes and slipstreams. They don't have to go through 14 to 18 months of waiting. That's already here. That's already been done. Thousands of authorized economic operators around the world. Let's do it for the circular economy. You can have bounded economic zones right next to the port, where these used electronic goods, for example, can come in, be very closely monitored and audited, remanufactured, repaired, exported, or brought into the domestic market. There's loads of tools out there that we can do right now. So I think it's just a case of really getting the people, and there's real experts who already know how to do this, combined with the likes of Reinhard, who's like working on the ground, combined with the broader global circular economy community. I think we really need to bring that together and recognize it's not just the circular community thinking of this. There's already experts out there who already probably have solutions and know how to do it. So that would be my main pitch.
We know what we need to know. We just don't know yet that we know it. Very good. I would suggest that we take a small round of questions. I first look at my panelists, whether they want to interact stronger to each other. And if I don't see any hand flying up, if I see one in the room. Yes, can't see you. I mean, I know that you're there, but I can't see you. But maybe if you just say your question and then I try to repeat it, and lacking a microphone, I don't think you have. I will repeat your question. Go ahead.
Right. I'm Jürgen, but I'm president of Citra.
So Jürgen, president of Citra.
Yes. So for the background, before joining Citra, I was vice president of the European Commission in charge of jobs, growth, investment, and competitiveness. And in this role, I was coordinating the all regulatory work in the EU on circular economy. So I just wanted to comment on your fantastic debate, because you have been at the core when it comes to promoting circular economy. Very often in the events like this, people focuses too much, to my taste, to financing. Because policymakers especially, I'm a former politician, usually when they try to promote something, they start immediately thinking how to maximize the use of taxpayers' money. But you have been talking about regulatory issues and trade obstacles and how to knock them down. So I just wanted to thank for your excellent debate, because I believe that market regulation is even more important than financing if we want to promote circular economy. So if anybody found any question in this comment, so feel free to comment what I said, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and kudos to the excellent panel. Any more questions, comments, remarks? I think I see something there. I just don't know where I see it, but I'm sure a microphone will find its way. Go ahead. Somewhere in this direction, yes.
Thank you. I want to start. My name is Ulrich. I represent the European Business Chamber of Rwanda. And I want to start expressing my gratitude to Reinhard, which truly appreciate the fact that these digital solutions, digital platforms, that is increasing aids of today. Increasing trade, of course, of today. My question goes to Lidi. For a while ago, the EU implemented a digital platform called Access to Market. That has been a great success, and it was especially accelerated during the COVID. And I want to know, how has that affected import and export to and from Western Africa, and especially in your relation, Ghana? That's my question. Thank you.
That's a very nice detailed question. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if it has, to be honest. I think the fact that there's a focus on that is giving the fact that there's a focus on supporting it, that has the support. It's not that what I've been doing has had any specific direct influence from it, I believe. But I think it puts this conversation away from us talking about circular economy to realizing that the people who are doing the work, even myself, I'm not busy with topics like circular economy. I'm just busy buying waste and satisfying a demand somewhere else. That's what I'm doing, and I'm at this conference. But there's a lot of people that are just trading. So I think that's, in that sense, that's a mechanism to facilitate trade. So in that sense, it does help, I guess. I hope I understood that correctly.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure as a minimum we can book this as another instrument that we now know more about to keep in mind for facilitating more circular economy trade in the future. Any more requests for the floor? Yes, I see one.
Hello, hi, my name is Piotr Barczak from the European Environmental Bureau.
Can you get
yes,
a bit
Piotr Barczak from the European Environmental Bureau. Thank you very much. Very interesting conclusion in my head. Some positive, but there is also some negative. First of all, that me as an NGO representative, I'm a bit upset that we are looking at scaling up trade of waste. That is basically something we should not see in the sustainable world. But I will not expand on that because I have one interesting solution. Maybe because one idea here I took from the panel is that, yes, producers are not very keen to pay EPR in countries where there is no EPR schemes, of course. Governments are also slow in implementing that. But maybe there is one solution. I would like to hear your views of spearheading EPR kind of schemes in Africa. For example, if one of the streams that comes to Africa as electronics is second-hand electronics from Europe. Quite a lot of electronics from Europe are coming here as second-hand. They have been already covered by EPR rules in Europe. So there is a dedicated PRO, Producer Responsibility Organization, in Europe, who is responsible for taking care of this waste. Some part of this waste is treated in Europe, but some small part is indeed sent out. But the EPR fee that was paid by producers in Europe does not follow to Africa. So I wanted to hear your views whether this fund, well, first of all, maybe to all of you here, would you like to see this fund be traveling to Africa? I think yes, to finance. but yeah, what are your views on this? Why this is not happening? What should we do to make European politicians, European PROs accountable to do that? First, also, of course, data is missing, and we know that. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for your statement on, actually, we don't want to trade waste in the first place, but also on your interesting question. That would be a very interesting discussion when waste is actually waste, and I think that's something we will going to have in the context of circular economy and trade in the future quite a lot. But maybe one of my valued panelists want to take over the question on why does the EPR from Europe not come over here, which is actually quite a legitimate question.
Yeah,
yes.
Well, I'll
Jack.
pick up quickly, but I'll pass on. Just a great question, Piotr, and it's now becoming really commonly known, the loopholes in EPR and this problem. I just wanted to point out one area that's kind of blossoming in discussions around universal EPR, which is an idea that came out of Delft. It's still very early stages, but I would recommend you look it up. I think it's a really important discussion area. How can we either have a more unified framework or harmonized or mutually recognized framework? So a really important point to raise, and I'll pass on to others who know more about this than I do.
I'm no EPR expert, but one thing I can say is there's an easier way. So first of all, making something like a national EPR international, anyone that deals with finance will think, or lead legislation, I don't want to open that can of worms. But what about motivating the producers to do so voluntarily and paying more? If you say, as a producer in the Netherlands, take where our company is based, you will get credits towards your goals of how much you have to collect if you collect in Africa, for example. But the fee won't go, but you will get credits. You will get to your 80%, 60%, whatever you want to go. If you do that, then these companies will automatically start spending money to do so because they are being pushed to reach these collection goals by the EPR scheme. So simply make that statement and money will come, I think, from those producers. I know that it will, actually.
So I just want to make a last comment to say that for us in Ghana, and this is a very good question, just about 2 weeks ago, we're in Germany and we're asking the same question. You know, why can't the EPR that is paid in Europe, for instance in Germany, follow the equipment that comes to Ghana so that at the end of the life of the product, it can be used to work on it? The response we had was that maybe it's a good time to start talking about it. And I guess that this is a forum that goes far and wide. And so once the issue has been raised here, the discussions will go on even when we leave this place. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Also specific thanks here to Reinhard, who is very pragmatic, off the cuff, but actually in a way quite implementable suggestion. It shows you how much creativity is also in something that seems to be a dry topic, such as trade and circular economy, but it's not dry. It's at the heart of making circular economy a global thing from something which is at the moment very regional, and regional efforts alone do not solve global problems. So trade, I'm very happy that we could talk today about some of the challenges and some of the answers, and I would like to ask you to very much thank our panel. Lydia, Reinhard, Kimberly, and Jack, thank you so much for having been here, and thank you very much for your interest, for the interesting questions. For the interesting questions and contributions, and I would like to give back the floor to the World Circular Economy Forum and Tanya. There she comes.
Thank you so much. And let's give another round of applause to Stefan for the excellent moderation there. What a fantastic session. And what stood out for me is that we kind of dove really deeply into some of the challenges, but also had the opportunities outlined and even practical examples of how we can look into some of these trade issues. Now, of course, we do have the accelerator sessions that will be taking place on Thursday, some of which that we've outlined is they'll be connecting the dots, accelerating circular economy adoption across Africa, practical implementation of the Basel PIC procedure for exporters from developing countries, and a lot more. So make sure to check on the app, to check on the website to see some of these sessions that you'd be interested in participating. Right now, we're going to take a short break, and again, there'll be some refreshments over in the room next door. We'll be back right here at 4:20. Thank you.